Section 4 already. You're cranking. Now, a look at dive accessories and a bit about health for diving. After that, we'll go over the issues surrounding breathing air at depth and finish up with the confined water dive preview for your 4th confined water dive. You're familiar with the major components of scuba gear. Now let's take a look at the accessories that make diving more fun and go more smoothly. When shore diving and sometimes boat diving, you may tow a surface float. Surface floats give you a place to rest, provide flotation if there's a problem, carry accessories, and fly a dive flag. They also mark the dive site if you want to return after a surface interval. Sometimes you anchor your float and then stay near it. Sometimes you tow it to cover a wider area. If so, use a reel or line caddy to avoid entanglement, and don't attach it to you. That way you can simply let go if something snarls the line or a boat drags your float. You often use your surface float for flying a dive flag. Places popular with divers are often popular with boaters, skiers, and other water sports enthusiasts. The flag lets them know you're there, and for safety, local law often requires you fly one. Which of the 2 dive flag types you fly depends on where you are, and sometimes you may have to fly both, especially when boat diving. Local regulations may stipulate how close you have to stay to your flag and how far boats stay away. If no laws apply, stay within 15 meters, 50 feet. And boats should keep off 30 to 60 meters, 100 to 200 feet. But don't assume boaters see or recognize your flag. If you hear a boat engine, stay down until it passes. Even then, surface cautiously near your flag. You might think you only need a dive light at night, but they're useful during the day too, for looking into cracks or for revealing colors on deeper dives. Slates cost little and take up almost no room, yet they're the easiest option when what you have to say is too complicated for hand signals. Typical slates fit in your BCD pocket, though some kinds ride on the back of your console or your wrist. There's nothing more frustrating than missing a dive because you break a fin strap or something without a spare on hand. To avoid this angst, carry spares for those things that get lost or worn out, along with some basic tools in a watertight box in your gear bag. You'll be surprised how often your kit makes the difference between joining the fun or just watching it. Your open water diver certification card is like a diploma. It indicates that you've completed entry-level diver training. Your logbook is like your resume. It tells dive masters and other professionals what you've done with that training. Logbooks provide proof of experience often requested for diver training, and when diving at resorts or on charter boats. You want a logbook so you remember your dive experiences, to document your diver history, and to note specific details for future reference. Diving's relaxing, but not sedate, so you need to be in good health. Although you plan your dives to avoid overexertion, at times strenuous activity becomes part of it, and you need sufficient health, fitness, and conditioning to handle it. Good health includes good habits. Avoid alcohol, drugs, or tobacco prior to diving. Alcohol and some drugs can impair your judgment and may increase your risk of decompression sickness. Consume alcoholic beverages conservatively the night before diving to avoid dehydration, which may also contribute to decompression sickness. If you take a prescription drug, discuss its effects with your doctor. If in doubt, don't dive until you're no longer using it. Smoking is undeniably detrimental to your health and can interfere with an active lifestyle. If you do smoke, abstain for several hours before and after diving. Smoking theoretically raises your risk of lung overexpansion injury, even when you breathe normally. Don't dive if you don't feel well, including a cold. Diving with a cold can cause equalization problems and possible ear or sinus injuries. And diving with a chest cold can trap air, risking lung overexpansion injuries. Wait until you're well. Don't try to use cold medications to make the dive. Have a physical exam when you start diving, and at least every 2 years after. Maintain your physical fitness and keep immunizations, especially tetanus and typhoid, current. Eat and rest adequately. You don't have to be an Olympian, just in good average health. Dive health includes keeping your skills and knowledge sharp. The best way is to dive as often as you can and try new activities and visit new places. If you're away from diving for a while, no worries, it happens. Review your PADI Open Water Diver course materials and see a PADI dive center or resort about the Scuba Review program. Scuba Review refreshes your knowledge and skills, and you can usually do it in an evening or morning. If you're a woman, you may be concerned about menstruation or pregnancy. Menstruation shouldn't keep you from diving if it doesn't normally keep you from other active recreations. There's not much known about how diving affects a developing fetus, however, so the recommendation is to not dive while pregnant or trying to get pregnant. So far, you've learned a lot about the direct effects of breathing air underwater, such as why you need to breathe slowly and deeply and never hold your breath. There are also some indirect subtle effects that can cause problems. Fortunately, you can usually avoid these by following some simple guidelines. To understand these effects, you need to understand that air is 79% nitrogen and 21% oxygen. Your body uses oxygen but doesn't consume nitrogen. The air you breathe while diving is the same as the air you're breathing now, except it's filtered to remove impurities and moisture. The first possible, though rare, problem is contaminated air. This can happen when there's a problem with the air compressor or its filtering system, often resulting in air that smells and tastes bad. Fortunately, contaminated air is rare because dive operations recognize the seriousness of contaminated air and have their air tested frequently. Avoid these problems by only having your tank filled by professional dive operations. Never fill or attempt to have your tank filled by anything other than an air compressor system specifically designed for scuba diving. Never dive with air that tastes or smells bad, even if you filled it at a proper air source. And contaminated air can be odorless and tasteless. If you feel ill or get a headache while diving, end the dive. Divers breathing contaminated air may experience headaches, nausea, and even unconsciousness. They may have cherry red lips and fingernail beds, though this can be hard to see underwater. Give someone suspected of breathing contaminated air emergency oxygen and rescue breathing if necessary. Contact medical attention for the diver. If you suspect contaminated air, save the air for analysis, but don't dive with it. Another way you can suffer from contaminated air is by breathing exhaust fumes aboard a boat. Stay in fresh air to avoid this. Recreational divers sometimes use enriched air, also called nitrox, which has more oxygen than air does. This lets you stay underwater longer at certain depths, but enriched air can cause oxygen problems within recreational diving limits. For this reason, you need special training and certification to dive with enriched air. Don't dive with enriched air or try to have a cylinder filled with enriched air until you're trained and certified to use it.
Is that what you wanted again?
Although your body doesn't use the nitrogen, nitrogen becomes intoxicating under pressure, generally first noticeable around 30 meters, 100 feet, and becoming stronger as you go deeper. This is called nitrogen narcosis. Narcosis isn't directly harmful, but it impairs coordination, judgment, and can create a false sense of security. It can cause a disregard for safety and foolish behavior. The hazard is that these symptoms can lead to accidents or hamper responding properly to an emergency. If you feel nitrogen narcosis or your buddy acts impaired, Ascend to shallower water. It diminishes quickly. You avoid nitrogen narcosis by avoiding deep dives. You've already learned that you have underwater time limits beyond those imposed by your air supply, comfort, and fatigue. These limits relate to nitrogen gas dissolving from your breathing air into your body tissues during a dive. This is caused by the increased pressure you're under. The two primary factors that determine how much excess nitrogen you absorb are how deep you go and how long you stay. Deeper and/or longer equals more nitrogen. Ascending takes you to lesser pressure, and the excess nitrogen begins to come out of solution and leave your body. Your body doesn't use nitrogen, so what goes in must come out. As long as you keep excess nitrogen within reasonable limits by properly using dive tables and dive computers, the excess nitrogen normally leaves your body without complications. But if you exceed established depth and time limits, the nitrogen comes out of solution faster than your body eliminates it, causing bubbles to form in your tissues. This causes decompression sickness, sometimes called the bends. Though time and depth are your primary factors influencing nitrogen absorption and elimination, secondary factors include fatigue, dehydration, vigorous exercise, cold, age, illness, injuries, alcohol consumption, and being overweight. Besides these 9 factors, diving at altitude and flying after diving have special considerations you'll learn more about in Section 5. Therefore, you always want to dive well within the limits of your dive tables or computer, and use extra caution if any secondary factors apply to you. Make a habit of leaving a conservative margin between your actual dive time and how long your table or computer says you can stay. Bubbles can form anywhere in the body, so decompression sickness symptoms vary widely. They include paralysis, shock, weakness, dizziness, numbness, tingling, difficulty breathing, and different degrees of limb and joint pain. In the most severe cases, unconsciousness and death are possible. Signs and symptoms may also be subtle, including a mild to moderate dull ache, usually but not necessarily in the joints. Weakness, lightheadedness, and prolonged fatigue may be symptoms. Symptoms usually occur between 15 minutes and 12 hours after a dive, and tend to come on gradually and get worse. No matter how mild the symptoms, consider possible decompression sickness serious. Lung overexpansion injuries and decompression sickness, while having different causes, produce similar signs and symptoms. Together they're called decompression illness because you don't need to distinguish between them when assisting a diver. First aid is the same as you learned in Section 3, including having the diver lie down and breathe emergency oxygen. Contact local emergency medical care and the local diver emergency service if available, or the closest recompression chamber. Monitor the diver for breathing, pulse, shock, and provide rescue breaths and CPR as needed. Lay an unresponsive breathing diver left side down, head supported, and breathing oxygen, like you learned in Section 3. Don't delay first aid in getting the diver to treatment, which requires recompression in a chamber. The faster treatment begins, the lower the risk of permanent residual symptoms. Although decompression sickness is a serious condition, you reduce the risk by properly following established safe time and depth limits. You avoid lung overexpansion injury by breathing continuously and never holding your breath. Part of avoiding both includes making a slow ascent, with a short pause at 5 meters, 15 feet, called a safety stop. You'll learn more about these in Section 5. If your body tolerates only a certain level of excess nitrogen, how do you know what that level is, and how do you stay within it? By guessing? No, you use dive tables and computers that express a mathematical decompression model developed to track the theoretical amount of nitrogen in your body. But keep in mind that you're applying a mathematical model. Theoretical models can't account for individual variations, so stay well within the limits predicted by your tables or dive computer, especially if any of the secondary factors you learned apply to you. Remember, because people differ in their susceptibility to decompression sickness, no dive table or computer can guarantee that decompression sickness will never occur, even though you dive within the table or computer limits. Plan your dive well within limits and the risk is minimal. But the only way to avoid all risk is to not go diving. As a recreational diver, you plan all your dives as no decompression dives. This means you can always ascend directly to the surface without having to stop, yet without significant decompression sickness risk. This is also called no-stop diving because you don't have to stop, though you usually will for extra conservatism. Dive tables have been around since 1907 and were the primary dive planning tool until the rise of dive computers in the 1980s. Although you'll use computers most of the time, you still learn to use tables. First, because it helps you understand what your computer does, and second, because computers can fail. If you have tables, you won't miss out on all the fun. Most dive tables were designed for military or commercial diving. However, you'll be using the Recreational Dive Planner, RDP for short, the only dive tables designed and tested exclusively for no-stop recreational diving. You'll learn to use either the table or the wheel format of the RDP. Dive computers do the same job as dive tables, and they do it the same way, by calculating how much nitrogen you theoretically have in your body. They're no more or less valid than dive tables. So don't let the electronics, displays, and digitals impress you. The computer's advantage is this. Being printed, dive tables provide a series of dive profile approximations that you fit your actual profile within. A computer, on the other hand, integrates a depth gauge, timer, and software to write a custom table for your exact profile, updating it as you go. Computers are more convenient to use and help minimize human error. Dive tables have to assume you spend all your time at your deepest depth, but computers give you more no-stop time in a multi-level profile by crediting you for time at shallower depths. The wheel version of the RDP lets you get multi-level credit too, but not as precisely as a computer because computers follow your profile more exactly. Computers track your nitrogen levels throughout the day, which isn't difficult with tables, but computers do it automatically. Computers have disadvantages, the primary one being that they can fail before, during, or after a dive. So be sure to have tables along for backup. Computers will also provide numbers for dive practices that aren't recommended, so don't turn your brain off when you turn your computer on. And computers give more no-stop time by eliminating rounding, but you give up the extra conservatism rounding provides. But given the advantages, it's more unusual to see a diver without one than with one. This is why it's one of the first pieces of equipment you'll want to invest in. You'll learn more about diving effectively with a computer in Section 5. Dive tables and computers tell you your maximum dive time without required decompression stops, the no decompression limit, but they also account for nitrogen you absorbed on previous dives. This is because when you surface, you have excess nitrogen in your body from the dive. This is called residual nitrogen. In theory, it takes several hours, even longer than a day sometimes, for all the residual nitrogen to leave your body. If you make another dive while you still have residual nitrogen, you're making a repetitive dive. You have to account for the residual nitrogen in your body when determining your no decompression limits for a repetitive dive. Before your first dive, your nitrogen level is normal. After your dive, you surface within accepted limits, but you've got more nitrogen than normal. During your surface interval, your body eliminates some of this nitrogen. But if you make a repetitive dive, your nitrogen level equals the nitrogen left from the first dive, plus what you absorb on the repetitive dive. The Recreational Dive Planner and dive computers allow you to track changing theoretical nitrogen levels so you can determine your allowable no-stop dive time.
About an hour, 'cause it's gonna take
How long you have to wait before a dive isn't considered repetitive, depends on the dive table or computer. With the RDP, if you don't plan to dive for 6 hours, residual nitrogen has little consequence. If you do dive within 6 hours, you have to account for the residual nitrogen, which is pretty easy with the RDP.
Okay, E.
You'll learn to use the Recreational Dive Planner with the Instructions for Use study booklet that comes with it. Before you get started, let's go over the general rules you follow when using the RDP. Bottom time is the total time in minutes from when you begin your descent to when you begin a direct ascent to your safety stop and the surface. Some divers time from descending to surfacing, which is fine because it's more conservative than the true definition of bottom time. Plan dives shallower than 10 meters, 35 feet, as though they were to 10 meters, 35 feet. Use the exact depths and times shown on the RDP. If your dive falls between shown depths, use the next greater depth and/or time. Ascend at 18 meters, 60 feet per minute or slower. Slower is fine. Be a safe diver. Slowly ascend from every dive. Be conservative and plan your dives well within the RDP limits. Avoid the maximum limits shown. When planning a dive in cold water or under strenuous conditions, plan your dive as though it were 4 meters, 10 feet deeper than it actually is. Plan repetitive dives so they're to an equal or shallower depth than the previous dive. The vast majority of scientific data about decompression is based on deep to shallow planning, so diving this way keeps you within profiles with proven reliability. Limit your repetitive dives to 30 meters, 100 feet or less. Limit your depth to your experience and training. For newly certified open water divers, 18 meters, 60 feet. 30 meters, 100 feet is the recommended general limit. With 40 meters, 130 feet, the absolute maximum limit for recreational divers who have the experience and training required. Plan your dives well within RDP limits. Note that 42 meters, 140 feet appears on the RDP for emergency purposes only. Don't dive that deep.
I've done that about 85 times.
By now, you're pretty comfortable in the water. Good. Let's take a look at what you'll be doing in your fourth confined water dive. For starters, you'll be doing some stuff without scuba gear. Skin diving. Why, you ask? Because skin diving goes hand in hand with scuba diving all the time. It's an easy way to scope out a potential scuba site fast. Or the water may be so shallow, you don't need scuba. You'll use the same gear you use for scuba, except the scuba. And you'll either use a bit less weight than usual so you're positively buoyant, or you'll wear a snorkeling vest. Without a tank, you obviously hold your breath when you swim down to look at something. To extend breath hold time, you can use hyperventilation, which is simply taking 3 or 4 rapid, deep breaths before holding your breath. Hyperventilation reduces the carbon dioxide in your system, and since it's carbon dioxide that stimulates breathing, you can go longer before you feel the urge to breathe. But hyperventilate no more than 3 or 4 breaths. If you do more, you can blow off so much carbon dioxide that your body runs out of oxygen before you feel the need to breathe. This would cause you to black out without warning and drown. Don't hyperventilate excessively. And rest a minute or so between dives. If you feel fatigued, dizzy, or lightheaded, stop diving down and catch your breath at the surface. Since you're holding your breath while skin diving, you want to go down fast with minimal effort using the head-first surface dive. Goes like this. Deflate your snorkeling vest if you're using one. Then swim like this, hyperventilating 3 or 4 breaths at the same time. Hold the last breath, bend forward and thrust your legs straight up like so their weight drives you down. Kick when your fins come under, equalizing like you do with scuba as you head to the bottom. As you come up, look up, reach up, and be sure you have a clear view so you don't run into anything. Your buddy waits at the surface while you're down, and vice versa. That's so he's got a fresh breath if he needs to come down to assist you. There's an easy way to clear your snorkel when you come up from a skin dive, called displacement clearing. Note that when you look up, the snorkel tips lower than the mouthpiece. Exhale through the final few meters or feet, and the air pushes the water out of the snorkel. Keep exhaling as your head rolls forward at the surface, and hey, your snorkel's clear. But this only works if you have a snorkel with no self-drain, or a small self-drain valve. If you have a bigger valve, the air bubbles out instead of clearing the snorkel. No big deal, though. A valve that big means it's super easy to blast clear anyway. After you've skin dived a bit, your instructor will get you back into your scuba. You may practice the sitting back roll entry, which is great from a low, unstable platform like a small boat. Sit at the edge of the platform, make sure all your gear's in place, put some air in your BCD, check the entry area, then lean back while holding your mask and breathing from your regulator. Keep your legs tucked so your feet don't smack the edge. You might feel disoriented a moment, then you pop up. Let your buddy know you're okay and clear the entry area. You already know how to remove and replace your mask, so now you'll practice swimming without it, like you might if you had to surface after losing it. Remember to breathe through your mouth and exhale through your nose if you feel water tickling it. Open your eyes. You'll see well enough to swim. If you're wearing contacts, don't. Let your buddy guide you so you don't lose them. Okay, time to demonstrate what a pro you become with buoyancy. You're going to hover motionless for at least 30 seconds without using your fins or hands. Start by getting neutral on the bottom, then gently push away from the bottom a short ways. Don't hold your breath, but use your lung volume to maintain your depth. If you begin to rise, breathe with your lungs a bit less full, or a bit more full if you start to sink. It helps to find a visual reference, like a mark on the pool wall, to gauge where you are. Practice, and it's easy. Confined Water Dive 4, here we come!
Section 5. Not far to go now. Let's look at special dive table and computer procedures and a bit about using a dive computer. From there, you'll find your way through basic compass navigation and then find out how to continue your adventure so your fins don't gather dust after you earn your certification. After that, you'll get a look at the Confined Water Dive preview. Ready? Let's hop to it. Now that you've got the basics down for using the recreational dive planner and dive computers, let's consider some special situations, like how to lower your DCI risk even further, how to handle accidentally exceeding your no decompression limit, and what you need to do if you fly after diving or dive at altitude. Although you plan all your dives as no decompression dives without required stops, most of the time you'll make a stop anyway. This is called a safety stop, It adds conservatism by giving your body extra time to eliminate nitrogen and to adjust your buoyancy so you ascend under control. To make a safety stop, you plan your dive so you can pause at 5 meters, 15 feet, for 3 or more minutes on your way to the surface. Plan a safety stop as standard practice for all your dives, but consider it mandatory if you dive deeper than 30 meters, 100 feet. If your ending pressure group comes within 3 pressure groups of the no stop limit on the RDP, or if you reach any limit on the RDP or your computer. Plan safety stops for all your dives, but forgo the stop if emergencies, assisting your buddy, rising, bad weather and so on, make it more important to surface immediately. You plan your dive within the no-stop limits, but something unplanned delays your ascent and you exceed them. Now you must make an emergency decompression stop to eliminate excess nitrogen. But, unlike a safety stop, without this stop you face an unacceptable decompression sickness risk when you surface. With the RDP, if you're no more than 5 minutes past the limit when you start your ascent, make an 8-minute or longer stop at 5 meters, 15 feet. After surfacing, don't dive for at least 6 hours to reduce the high nitrogen in your body. If you're more than 5 minutes over the limit, a 15-minute stop or longer is urged, air supply permitting. If not, stay as long as you can. Then don't dive for at least 24 hours. As an added precaution, you can breathe emergency oxygen if available, and in any case, monitor yourself for decompression sickness symptoms. Emergency decompression methods vary somewhat with the computer, so check the manufacturer's instructions. Regardless of type, all specify the stop depth and show you when it's okay to surface. It's not recommended that you make a repetitive dive after a dive requiring emergency decompression, even if your computer will calculate it for you. Remember that in recreational diving, required decompression stops are for emergency situations only. As you recall, when you ascend to a higher altitude, pressure decreases. Dive tables and most computers give you limits based on surfacing at sea level. At altitude, there's less pressure. So nitrogen in your body can form bubbles more easily after a dive. So, if you use the RDP at an altitude above 300 meters, 1,000 feet, you need to use special conversion tables and special procedures. With a dive computer, the procedures vary, so you'll need to check the manufacturer's guidelines. In any case, if you'll be diving at altitude, see your PADI Dive Centre resort or instructor about the gear you need and the Altitude Adventure Dive and the Altitude Diver course. Lower atmospheric pressure also pertains to flying after diving. The concerns are similar to altitude diving, but not identical. The dive medical community makes these recommendations, whether you're using the RDP or a dive computer. First, after a single dive, a 12-hour minimum surface interval is required to be reasonably assured you remain symptom-free from decompression sickness upon ascent to altitude in a commercial airliner with a cabin pressure up to 2,400 meters, 8,000 feet. Second, after repetitive dives, diving several days in a row, or a dive requiring decompression stops, the medical community suggests a minimum surface interval of 18 hours before flying. The greater the duration before flight, the less likely decompression sickness will occur. At the present, there aren't any guidelines for driving to altitude after diving, so the prudent action is to be conservative. Flying after diving and decompression recommendations change over time, and it's your responsibility as a diver to keep up with and follow the most current guidelines. Read dive publications and keep in touch with your dive centre or dive resort. In the last section, you learned to plan your dive with the RDP as though it were 4 meters, 10 feet deeper than it really is if the dive's particularly cold or strenuous. How you do this with a computer depends on the type. Some types have sophisticated models that readjust if the water's cold or your breathing rate's high. Others may have settings that allow you more conservative limits, but if not, you'll need to make sure you always have ample no-stop time showing. It's especially prudent to make a safety stop at the end of a cold or strenuous dive. From previous discussions, you've learned a lot already about diving with computers, but it's important to keep several points in mind when using your dive computer. First, remember that computers are essentially calculators with built-in depth gauges and timers. They're no more or less valid than dive tables, and they don't track anything physical in your body. The recommendations for conservative diving with tables apply to diving with computers. Don't share your computer. You and your buddy should have your own. You end your dive based on the most conservative. Leave your computer running between dives. Most won't let you turn them off anyway, but if you pull out the battery or something, it loses its memory of your residual nitrogen. That means no diving for 24 hours or more. Let your computer shut down on its own. Generally, plan your dives so you make the deepest dive first. During the dive, start at the deepest point and progress shallower. Dive conservatively by staying well within computer limits. Try to have 5 or more minutes no-stop time remaining at all times. If your computer quits, you may need to stop diving for 12 to 24 hours, according to manufacturer guidelines. If it quits underwater, ascend immediately to 5 meters, 15 feet, and make a stop of 5 minutes or more before surfacing. After the dive, you can't just grab another one because it doesn't know how much residual nitrogen you have. If you've been tracking your dive times, depths and surface intervals and staying within RDP limits, you can continue diving with it. If not, you'll probably have to wait until the next day. Keep the wheel handy so you can plan multi-level dives that maximize your no-stop dive time. Don't blindly accept everything your computer says. It can fail, just like any other piece of gear. Read the manufacturer's instructions completely before using your computer. You can learn more about diving with computers in the PADI Multi-Level Diver course. During your open water dives, you'll learn the fundamentals for navigation. Effective navigation makes diving more fun because you don't waste time finding the best parts of the reef. You know where you are, and you can return to your exit point with ample air. With experience, you'll learn to navigate from environmental cues. But even then, you'll find compass use makes it easier to figure out where you are and where you're going. Using a compass is based on the fact that a compass needle always points to the North Pole. By knowing where north is, you can determine any other direction. An underwater compass has 4 features you use for navigating. The lubber line indicates your travel direction. It runs straight through the center of your compass. When compass navigating, you always travel along the lubber line. The magnetic north needle is a needle or an arrow printed on a disc that rotates so that it can always point to magnetic north. The bezel rotates so you can align the 2 index marks over the compass needle, helping you maintain a straight line while you swim. Most underwater compasses have the heading references in degree heading numbers so you can record your travel direction. To navigate, first you need to hold your compass correctly, level and squarely in front and ahead so the lubber line aligns with your body center line. If your compass rides in your console, hold it like this. As you swim, you want to keep the lubber line aligned this way, so you swim straight. Look over the compass as you go rather than down on it. Point the lubber line in the direction you want to go. Hold the compass level and let the needles settle. Then, turn the bezel until you place the index marks over the needle. Now, simply swim along the lubber line, keeping the needle in the index marks by adjusting your direction as necessary. When you're ready to head back, turn the bezel so the index marks are exactly opposite their original location. Some compasses have 2 sets, so you don't have to do this. Next, turn until the needle sits inside the marks again, which faces you back the way you came. Swim along the lubber line, like you did on the way out. You're pretty close to becoming a PADI open water diver, and you're probably looking forward to your open water dives. But it's time to look beyond them and think about what you'll do after you become a diver. You need to meet people, go places, and do things. Since you don't dive alone, the more divers you know, the more dive opportunities you'll have. Get the telephone numbers and addresses of all the new friends you've made in this course. You know these divers, and like you, they'll want to go diving. Next, join a dive club. Your PADI dive centre or resort probably sponsors one, and it's likely a local PADI Diving Society chapter. And don't worry that you're new to diving. Every group has divers at all experience levels. They plan activities with this in mind, and it's a great way to learn from more seasoned divers. Dive travel's another great way to meet people. Take a trip led by your local PADI dive centre or resort. You'll get to dive, of course, and dive travel is also about the adventures of visiting new cultures and seeing new parts of the world. But don't let time and money limit you. You may be surprised how much fun you can have on local dive adventures, not far from where you live. When you first start diving, swimming around exploring is such a novelty that it seems an end in itself, and it often is. But diving's more than that. It's a personal experience about gaining the skills you need to visit the sites you want to see. It's about having the gear you want, so you can experience the underwater adventures you think worthwhile. It's about rising to the challenges you think deserving, so that your diving grows with you. Only you can say whether this means artistic challenges like underwater photography, skill challenges like navigation or search and recovery, or technical challenges like enriched air diving or deep diving, or all of these. Continuing your education past open water diver has many benefits. It introduces you to special activities and gets you acquainted with diving in different environments and conditions. It builds your knowledge, skills, and confidence as a diver. And to do this, continuing education lets you meet people, go places, and do things underwater. Its purpose is to help you get out of diving what you got into diving for. What's it like at 30 meters, 100 feet? Is it hard to make an underwater video? Will you find diving after dark scary or exhilarating? Get the answers with PADI Adventure Dives, which introduce you to the basics of special underwater activities. Know what they call a diver who's made 3 adventure dives? An adventure diver, of course. And if you make 5, including the underwater navigation adventure dive, you'll qualify as a PADI Advanced Open Water Diver. You can earn these certifications over time, or in as little as a single day or weekend. By learning more about diving, you get out of it what you got into it for. That's what the Adventures in Diving program is all about. Get a few adventure dives under your belt, and you'll find you love some of these activities. PADI specialty diver courses extend and broaden what you learned in the adventure dive for that specialty. Typically, you make 2 to 4 dives, and the adventure dive you made usually counts as the first dive for the whole course. You've learned that no matter how many dives you've logged, it's a good idea to get a local orientation when diving in a new area, and that the Discover Local Diving program provides exactly that. A single, supervised open water experience, so you learn about local conditions, hazards, and points of interest. Likewise, you've already learned about refreshing your skills if you're out of the water for several months or more. Scuba review usually takes no more than a morning. You do some self-study, then jump into a confined water dive to polish up your skills. In the Rescue Diver course, you'll learn a lot of skills you hope you never need. It's a demanding, challenging course, and you know what? You'll love it. Virtually all who take this course cite it as the most rewarding one they've taken. You might say it's serious fun. Earn the PADI Advanced Open Water Diver and Rescue Diver certifications, then the most prestigious non-professional rating awaits you, Master Scuba Diver. Achieving this rating not only denotes your commitment to diving, but marks you as a skilled and accomplished diver. At some point, you may decide to make diving a full or part-time profession. You may be thinking about it already. After Rescue Diver, your next step is PADI Dive Master, where you sharpen your dive skills, learn to organise and conduct dive activities, and learn to assist with divers in training. Following Dive Master, you enter the Assistant Instructor course, which develops the fundamentals of teaching diving. Next, you attend the PADI Instructor Development course, a comprehensive program during which you'll learn and demonstrate the practical aspects of teaching diving. After this, you must successfully complete a 2-day instructor examination conducted by one of PADI's worldwide offices. This certifies you as a PADI Open Water Scuba Instructor, the most sought-after professional in the dive community. But at each step, you're diving, meeting people, going places, doing things. Time for a reality check and some truths about diving. For one, you're going to have dive experiences you don't like. You might get seasick or find yourself with a buddy you don't care for, or who knows. But this doesn't differ from anything else. Whatever's worth doing has less than perfect moments. They're not reasons to quit. They're reasons to do it different next time. Don't let a bad day ruin diving for you. Learn from it. Pursue what you want out of diving at your pace, and you'll have many, many happy dive memories for each one you'd rather forget. Second, it's better to have your own gear. It really is. When you have your own stuff, you dive more and dive more comfortably because you avoid the hassles of fitting into rental gear every time you want to go under. You don't have to buy everything all at once, but do if you want to. But keep this in mind and invest in your own kit as your budget allows. Third, you get out of diving what you put into it. If you ever find yourself bored with it, it's your own fault. You need to look at what you're doing and what you want out of it. If you're not satisfied, turn in a new direction. Do something new that awakens your passion and excites you. There are divers who've made thousands of dives in more than 30 years, and for them, diving is still fresh and new. They're still meeting new people, going new places, doing new things. Only you can make yourself reach for what's new and exciting in diving. Okay, so you don't look back in a year and wonder why you've not been diving. Go to your PADI Dive Centre or resort and do one of the following before you finish this course. 1. Sign up for a dive trip. 2. Sign up for a local dive with the Stores Club, or the local PADI Diving Society chapter. 3. Sign up for a PADI specialty course, the Adventures in Diving program, or an adventure dive. 4. Invest in a regulator BCD package or an exposure suit package. Do not leave until you do one or more of these. No, we're not kidding. because research shows that people who immediately travel, get involved with a dive club, continue their education, and invest in their own gear are more likely to get out of diving what they got into diving for. Plan your next step now. Meet people, go places, do things underwater.
Good morning, class.
It's almost time for your last confined water dive.
Ready to go diving?
You'll learn a couple of new skills and polish the ones you've already mastered.
You remember when we practiced?
There may be times you need to remove and then replace your weight system. To remove a weight belt, release the buckle and grasp the free end. Pull it clear, but hold it close so it doesn't pull you over. Whether at the surface or underwater, there are 2 ways to put your weight belt back on. For one, lie horizontally, face up. Hold the free end at your right hip, then roll to the left face down so the belt drapes across your back. Check for twists, misadjusted weights, and secure the buckle. The other way, make a loop and hold the belt behind you. Reach back and take an end with each hand, making sure your left hand gets the buckle. Pull the belt into place. Then lie face down and drape the belt across your back. Check for twists, misadjusted weights, and secure the buckle. If you're using a weight-integrated BCD, removing and replacing the scuba unit accomplishes removing and replacing your weights. You may need to remove and replace your scuba unit to adjust it, to clear an entanglement, or when entering and exiting from a small boat. Underwater, make sure all the air's out, and then take it off from the left so you don't pull the regulator out of your mouth. You can replace it by reversing what you just did, putting it on right side first, again so you don't tug the second stage from your mouth. Or you can put the unit on overhead. Lay the unit face up in front of you, like this. Note the second stage between the arms as you put your hands through the sleeves. Then lift it overhead and lower it into place. Make sure your hoses are clear and fasten the waist strap. At the surface, you can take it off like you did underwater, but be sure to put some air in it so it floats. To put it back on, try making the unit slightly buoyant. Then sit on it with the tank between your legs. Put your arms in the jacket sleeves, then slip forward. Presto! The unit rises into place. Check that your hoses are clear and fasten the waist strap. Okay, time to finish your open water dives and complete your certification as a PADI open water diver. Congratulations! You've accomplished a lot and come a long way. And yet for you, the adventure is just beginning.
Okay, 2 down. After you finish Section 3, you're more than halfway to PADI Open Water Diver and almost all the way to PADI Scuba Diver. During this section, we'll look at some things you'll need to know about the dive environment, plus go over some more detail about dive planning. We'll look at boat diving, one of the most fun ways to get out on the water. And you'll learn basic emergency handling in the problem management discussion. Then it's off to look at your next underwater adventure in the Confined Water Dive preview for your 3rd Confined Water Dive. So let's go! You've probably noticed that the underwater world has variables that affect it. Temperature, visibility, bottom composition, aquatic life, and sunlight. You already know that you need to consider water temperature. How much insulation you need varies with how cold it is. But what's not so obvious is that temperature changes with depth, generally getting colder as you go deeper. Different temperatures tend to form distinct layers, so in calm water you drop abruptly from warmer into cooler water. This is called a thermocline, and the difference above and below it can be as much as 8 to 11 degrees Celsius, 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So for adequate protection, choose your exposure suit based on the temperature at your dive depth. Visibility affects the diving so much, it's often the first thing you want to know about the dive site. Lots of variables affect visibility: water movement, weather, how easily you stir up the bottom, and so on. Limited viz makes it more difficult to keep track of your location and your buddy. You handle this by using your compass and other clues to navigate, and by staying closer to your buddy than you otherwise might. If it's real lousy, it may be better to pull the plug and do something else. Diving's supposed to be fun. Clear water can disorient you too. The bottom might seem closer than it is, so check your computer or depth gauge frequently to avoid exceeding your planned depth. Earlier, you learned to dive relaxed and avoid overexertion. That's why you need to account for currents when you go diving. A current is water movement, usually caused by the wind, heat, tides, or waves. Trying to swim against a current, even a mild one, can quickly tire and exhaust you. You suck up your air faster, too. You need to use the right techniques and avoid all but the mildest currents. When there's a mild current, you generally begin your dive swimming against the current. That way you don't have to fight it to get back to the boat or your exit point. If you accidentally end up down current from your exit, don't try to swim against it. Swim perpendicular to the current to reach the boat's trail line or to reach shore. Swimming against the current will quickly exhaust you. Try to avoid long swims against a current, especially on the surface. If you must swim against very light current a short distance, do it on the bottom if you can, where the current's usually much weaker. If you get caught in a current when boat diving and can't make the boat, don't fight it. Fill your BCD or drop your weights if necessary. Rest and relax. Stay calm, signal the boat, and wait for it to pick you up. Diving in strong currents requires special training and experience beyond what you'll have as a beginner. Most of the good stuff is on the bottom, so that's where you spend most of a dive. The bottom composition affects the techniques you use. Some bottoms, like silt, mud, and sand, stir up easily. You don't want to do that, So stay above the bottom and use care exiting and entering the water. Regardless of bottom type, stay neutrally buoyant and well above the bottom so you don't stir it up and so you don't harm any delicate underwater organisms. You'll learn to recognize unsensitive bottoms that you can settle on without significant risk to you or the environment, but it's best to avoid direct bottom contact as much as possible. Another fragile diving environment you may encounter underwater is a shipwreck or other submerged cultural site. Divers share a special privilege of having access to some of the world's underwater sites that may be part of our cultural heritage or maritime history. In order to preserve these sites for future generations, it's important to fine-tune your buoyancy and streamline your equipment to avoid disturbing or damaging the site during your dive. Resist the urge to remove articles from these sites and be certain to obey all local laws and regulations. And avoid tying to or anchoring on sites in a manner that may cause a disturbance or possible damage. Overall, respect our wrecks and the cultural heritage that lies beneath the surface of the water. As a diver, you'll interact actively or passively with the aquatic life. Active implies physical contact, which, more often than not, is associated with harming organisms, like bumping coral or hunting for fish. Passive interaction, on the other hand, involves leaving organisms relatively undisturbed, like taking pictures or just watching. As you might imagine, responsible divers engage primarily in passive interaction with aquatic life. The typical aquatic animal's response to an approaching diver is to flee. The vast majority are timid and harmless. If you spot a potentially aggressive animal, remain still and calm on the bottom. Watch it, but don't swim toward it because that could trigger defensive behavior. Chances are it's just passing through. Enjoy the view because you don't get to see these creatures often. If it hangs around, calmly swim away along the bottom, keeping an eye on it, and exit the water. Nine simple precautions will help you avoid problems with aquatic animals. First, treat all of them with respect. Don't tease them or intentionally disturb them. Second, be especially careful where you put your hands and feet in murky water. Third, shiny jewelry can resemble bait fish or small prey, so it's best to dive without it. Fourth, if you spearfish, remove fish from the water immediately to avoid attracting predators. Fifth, wear gloves and exposure suits to avoid stings and cuts, but remember that some stingers and spines will go right through them, so stay cautious. Sixth, swim neutrally buoyant well above the bottom. Seventh, move slowly and carefully. And eighth, watch where you put your limbs. Finally, ninth, don't touch unfamiliar animals. If you don't know what it is, don't touch it. A good rule of thumb is that if it's very ugly, very pretty, or doesn't flee from you, don't touch it. The first thing you'll notice about aquatic plants is that they're easier to sneak up on than many aquatic animals. Aquatic plants range from giant kelp forests to grasses and algae in freshwater lakes and rivers. There's a small possibility of entanglement in some of these, but keep streamlined, watch where you go, and avoid dense growth areas, and this won't be much problem. If you do get snagged, it's usually no big deal. Stop and back up slightly. Don't turn around because it just wraps the vegetation around you. It's usually only a strand or two hanging you up, which you and your buddy can clear easily. If you're caught in more than a few strands, try breaking the strands by bending and snapping it. This is often more effective than trying to cut free with your knife. One thing about diving is that it gets you out in the sun a bunch. causes the most common diving injury: sunburn. It can really make you miserable, so be prudent. Wear sunscreen and protective clothing. Stay in the shade as much as possible, and don't forget your sunglasses. Freshwater sites include lakes, quarries, springs, and rivers. They're great for photography, exploration, and wreck diving. Freshwater diving considerations include currents, easily disturbed bottom composition, limited viz, cold water, and abrupt thermoclines in boat traffic. All of which are saltwater considerations too, of course. Freshwater diving can include diving at sites higher than 300 meters, 1,000 feet above sea level. This requires special training and techniques to account for the altitude. Freshwater doesn't make you as buoyant as saltwater, so you don't need as much weight as when you wear the same gear and exposure suit in saltwater. Most recreational diving takes place in temperate and tropical saltwater. Saltwater considerations include waves, surf, tides, current, coral, boats, deep water, marine life, and remote locations. Any place you go has unique aspects and considerations, so again, check out a local orientation to a new area. The ocean is a dynamic environment. It can be tranquil and calm, or angry and powerful. This directly influences diving, so your instructor will cover what you need to know for your open water dives. Be sure to get a local orientation whenever you are diving in new conditions. Dive planning avoids disappointments due to misunderstandings, forgotten gear, poor conditions, and so on. It's really planning your fun. Think of it in 4 steps: advanced planning, preparation, last-minute preparation, and pre-dive planning. Advanced planning begins when you decide to go diving. At this stage, you generally call a buddy. Decide on an objective, what you're going to do. Pick a dive site and decide on logistics, such as where and when to meet.
Well, what we saw was
Consult your logbook if you need to, and plan an alternate site in case you can't dive at your first choice. It's a good idea to prepare at least a day or 2 ahead of the dive and visit your local dive center or resort. Check the weather and dive report. Get your tank filled. And use a checklist as you go through your gear, inspecting everything. This gives you time to correct any problems you find. Just before you leave, check the weather and let someone know where you're going, when to expect you back, and what to do if you're not. Grab last-minute stuff like your jacket, sunglasses, ice chest, and so on. Pack your dive bag, if you haven't already, with what you need first in last if you're boat diving. Finally, do an idiot check so you don't accidentally forget something. Right before the dive, plan the details. Check the conditions and decide whether to dive or head to your alternate site. Agree on where you'll enter, exit, and the course you'll follow. Review hand signals and communications. Decide what to do if you become separated, what your air, depth, and time limits will be, and what to do in an emergency.
If I have a problem with my ears, I'm going to tell you my ears are not okay.
Angelfish.
If you're a PADI scuba diver, you'll make the pre-dive plan with a PADI instructor, assistant instructor, or dive master who's leading your dive.
I know it's your second dive, so
Now do it. You have fewer problems and more fun when you plan your dive and use the plan. Plans don't have to be complicated, nor take a lot of work. They can be simple, take only a couple of minutes to discuss, and offer flexibility, but you should follow them. No one can plan a dive and follow that plan for you. You and your buddy have to do it. Although there's a lot of good diving from shore, if you're a diver, you're going to spend time on boats. They take you to sites you can't reach from shore. They eliminate long surface swims, and best of all, boating is fun. If you'll be boat diving in this course, your instructor will cover what you need to know for your open water dives. And as mentioned earlier, be sure to get a local orientation whenever you are boat diving in new conditions. Diving has an impressive safety record that's better than many other sports and adventure activities. But common sense tells you that going in water and under it presents risks and hazards. The PADI Open Water Diver and Scuba Diver courses teach you to minimize these. But if a problem does arise, you'll want to be able to care for yourself or another diver. We'll look at recognizing when a diver needs assistance, how to provide aid at the surface, and handling underwater problems. But if you'll be diving where you don't have secondary assistance, a dive master, instructor, lifeguard, or paramedic immediately available, you should have additional training in first aid, CPR, and diver rescue. The Emergency First Response, Primary and Secondary Care, and the PADI Rescue Diver courses provide these, expanding and refining your problem prevention and management skills. You'll probably find these among the most challenging and rewarding courses you complete as a diver. For now, focus on problem prevention and be prepared with emergency contact information such as local paramedics and police, radio frequencies for the Coast Guard, and contact information for the local diving emergency service, such as the Divers Alert Network. If there's no service where you're diving, then have contact information for the nearest recompression chamber. In any case, carry a mobile telephone, radio, change for a payphone, or some other way to contact help. Your instructor will provide information for your area. Although you scuba dive underwater, most problems occur at the surface. You prevent and control most problems simply by staying within your limitations, by relaxing, and by establishing and maintaining ample buoyancy at the surface. The first thing to do if you have a problem at the surface is to get buoyant if you're not already. Let your equipment work for you. Don't waste energy and exhaust yourself trying to stay up. Drop your weights. That's why they have a quick release. You can usually recover them later, and if not, they're easy to replace. If you need help, do the smart thing and ask. Whistle, wave, or yell, and get aid before a small problem becomes big. It makes things easier on you and other divers.
Okay, grab onto that and I'm coming.
It's often obvious when a diver has a problem, but often not. And you need to know the difference between a diver with a problem in control and one out of control, so you respond appropriately. Divers with a problem and in control normally appear relaxed. They generally signal for help if needed, keep their equipment on, move deliberately, and respond to instructions. Divers who panic have lost self-control and succumb to sudden, unreasoned fear. Instinctive, inappropriate behavior replaces trained, reasoned behavior. They typically fail to inflate their BCDs or drop their weights. They spit out their regulators and push their masks up or off. Fearing drowning, they expend tremendous energy keeping their head out of the water. Their eyes are wide and unseeing, and they don't usually respond to directions. Panic divers need immediate help because they will struggle until exhausted and unable to stay up. Assisting another diver has 4 steps. First, establish buoyancy for yourself and the diver. Second, calm the diver. Third, help the diver reestablish breathing control. And fourth, assist the diver out of the water. You reduce risk by assuring you won't sink. If you're in the water with the diver, inflate your BCD and ideally extend something that floats to the diver. If you're out of the water, stay there. Extend or throw flotation to the diver. If you don't have anything to give the diver, inflate his BCD or drop his weights, or both. Once buoyant, the diver will probably relax a bit. Talk to him and encourage him to breathe slowly and deeply. Then, if necessary, assist him out of the water. You'll practice towing another diver in your third confined water dive. You prevent most underwater problems by relaxing while you dive, keeping a close eye on your SPG and staying within your limits. The most likely underwater problems are overexertion, running low on or out of air, a free-flowing regulator, and entanglement. In Section 2, you learned how to prevent and handle overexertion. Overexertion makes you feel air-starved. As you learned, keep a slow, relaxed pace. If you or your buddy start to get out of breath, stop, rest, and catch your breath before moving on at a slower pace. You easily prevent running low on or out of air by watching your SPG. Sudden air loss due to a malfunction is almost unheard of. But suppose it happens. It's not a serious situation if you consider your options and take action. If you start up when your regulator begins breathing hard, you may be able to ascend normally, breathing lightly but continuously, because as water pressure decreases, you can use more of your tank air. Ascending with an alternate air source, like you've practiced, is your best all-round option. But you have to know where to find and how to use your buddy's alternate, so be sure to review that during the pre-dive safety check. Even if you're not as close to your buddy as you should be, you can still reach the surface safely using a controlled emergency swimming ascent if you're no deeper than, say, 10 to 12 meters, 30 to 40 feet. Simply look up, reach up, and swim up, keeping all your gear in place and making an ah sound, so you exhale all the way to the surface to prevent lung overexpansion injury. If you're too deep for a controlled emergency ascent and too far from your buddy to use his alternate, make a buoyant emergency ascent. Drop your weights, then ascend looking and reaching up while making an ah sound all the way to the surface. You'll exceed a safe ascent rate, so use this as a last resort if it's the only way to reach the surface. When you reach the surface following a low air or out of air emergency, you'll need to inflate your BCD orally or drop your weights to establish buoyancy. Today's regulators are very reliable and designed for fail-safe malfunctions that usually provide continuous air, free flow, rather than cut off your air. You can breathe from a free-flowing regulator, and you'll learn how in your next confined water dive. Entanglement is rare, but possible in aquatic plants, fishing line, tree branches, and the like. Avoid it by watching where you go, moving slowly, and keeping your equipment secured. But if you get hung up on something, stop, think, and then free yourself calmly. Get your buddy to help. If you're low on air or severely entangled, you may need to cut yourself free. If so, be careful about what you cut. Don't complicate the situation by cutting your gear, yourself, or the wrong thing. With tough rope or cable, cutting may be slower than disentangling. Do what's fastest. Swallowing water, extreme fatigue, entanglement, lung overexpansion, and other incidents can cause near drowning, becoming unresponsive and stopping breathing underwater. Near drowning requires an immediate response. The primary concern is to check for breathing and begin rescue breaths if the diver isn't breathing. If the diver has no pulse, you need to get the diver out of the water to perform CPR. Here are 4 general procedures if a diver appears to lose consciousness and become unresponsive underwater. First, bring the diver to the surface and check for breathing. Second, establish ample buoyancy for you and the victim. In some situations, you might do this and then check for breathing. Third, call for assistance as needed and available. Finally, help get the diver out of the water. Follow these procedures once you get the diver out of the water. They also apply to a diver who becomes unresponsive or experiences lung overexpansion injury symptoms after a dive, such as difficulty breathing, confusion, lowered alertness, unclear thinking, paralysis, visual problems, or chest pain. Keep the diver's airway open and check for breathing and pulse continuously. Provide rescue breathing and CPR as needed. If the diver has a pulse and is breathing, keep him lying on his left side in the recovery position if doing so doesn't interfere with any aid you're providing.
Deep breath, okay.
If the diver's responsive, lying supine is fine. Administer emergency oxygen and keep the diver still. Maintain normal body temperature by protecting her from heat or cold as necessary. Get emergency medical assistance. And if someone cannot go with the diver to medical treatment, write down as much background information as possible and send it with the diver. Time to dive again. Let's look at the fun you'll have in Confined Water Dive 3. By now you're aware that you use neutral buoyancy to dive relaxed, maneuver easily, ascend under control, and so on. During this dive, you'll practice the fin pivot, which develops your ability to fine-tune your buoyancy. And you'll do this by inflating your BCD orally as well as with your low-pressure inflator. You might do this after disconnecting a leaking inflator. Take a breath, switch to the BCD hose, and blow about 2/3 of your breath into it. Save enough to clear the regulator, and remember, blow bubbles when the regulator's out of your mouth. You might need to do this a few times. To fin pivot, lie face down, breathing slowly and deeply. Add air in short bursts to your BCD, or one breath at a time if you're inflating orally. Then inhale to see if you rise off the bottom. Gradually add air until you pivot up when you inhale and down when you exhale. This means you're neutrally buoyant. Some divers need to pivot on their knees or other body point, which is okay, but fin tips are best. By the way, if you're using a dry suit, your instructor will have you adjust it, not your BCD, to set your buoyancy. Once you're neutral, you'll notice your buoyancy changes with depth changes because the air in your BCD or dry suit expands or compresses. To maintain neutral buoyancy, add air as you go deeper and release air as you ascend. During your open water dives, to prevent an uncontrolled ascent, you release air from your BCD frequently as you go up. After you're neutral, your instructor will let you practice swimming around, adjusting your buoyancy. Pretend you're swimming over sensitive reef and try to keep from touching the bottom. This gets you ready for diving on a real reef. A cramp is a painful, involuntary muscle contraction. This can happen due to dehydration, cold, restricted circulation, wrong fin size, and working a muscle beyond its fitness level. It hurts, but it's easy to handle. Stop and rest the cramped muscle, gently stretching and massaging it. You can stretch out a leg cramp by pulling your fin tip, or by having your buddy brace your foot to push against. After relieving it, rest a few moments before resuming at a reduced pace. Sometimes a buddy's too tired or has severe cramps and can't swim effectively. Help out by getting both of you positively buoyant, then using the tired diver push, sometimes called the modified tired swimmer carry, which is simply a way to give the diver a push. Or you can assist by pulling with the tank valve toe. You'll practice both. You already know how to use an alternate air source and what it feels like to run out of air. Now you'll put these together. Your instructor will turn off your air just like before. When you feel it's hard to breathe, signal and secure your buddy's alternate. Your instructor will have you swim with your buddy using the alternate for at least a minute. When you switch back to your regulator, check your SPG to be sure your air's back on. Remember that a regulator malfunction is most likely to make it free flow. Now you'll practice breathing from a free-flowing regulator. You'll hold the purge button in to simulate the malfunction. Hold the mouthpiece near your mouth, but do not insert it fully. Let the excess escape while you sip the air you need. The flow may jostle and flood your mask a bit, but no worries. After you're done, which will be at least 30 seconds, check your SPG. You may be astonished just how much air you burn that quick. Recall that one option in a low or out-of-air emergency as deep as about 10 to 12 meters, 30 to 40 feet, is a controlled emergency swimming ascent. You'll practice this during this confined water dive, but since you won't be as deep as that, you'll practice horizontally. In open water, you'd reach up and look up. So for horizontal practice, you'll look and reach ahead. Then, keeping all your gear in place, you swim while exhaling continuously with an ah sound, so you don't hold your breath and risk lung overexpansion injury. For horizontal practice, you'll swim about 9 meters, 30 feet. After you get it down horizontally, your instructor may have you practice diagonally from the deeper to shallower water. And you'll find that when you do this for real during your open water dives, it's easier than going horizontally. Time to get into the real cool stuff, your open water dives. The first thing you do at a dive site is check out the conditions. Your instructor will show you how to account for weather, water temperature, bottom composition, waves, local area hazards, and so on. You'll also plan your entries and exits. Decide whether you can make the dive safely. This is your responsibility. If not, check your alternate site. You dive for adventure, fun, and a challenge, not to face unreasonable risk. Poor timing and sequence when you kit up can get you tired and overheated, like if you get in your exposure suit too soon or gear up way ahead of your buddy. Gear up at about the same pace as your buddy so you're ready to hit the water together. First, assemble your scuba unit and prep anything else that you can, like defogging your mask, before putting on a heavy exposure suit. Then put on your exposure suit and weights. When you're ready for your scuba unit, have your buddy help if necessary. Next, put on any wrist mount gauges. Then go through the pre-dive safety check. Finally, don your mask, snorkel, and gloves. Put your fins on just before entering the water if you're boat diving, or in waist-deep water when you're shore diving. Suiting up takes some forethought at first, but it becomes second nature after a couple of dives. The best technique for getting in the water depends on where you're diving. If you're not sure the best entry for where you are, get an orientation so you can enter and exit safely. For shore diving, the general recommendations are to begin with all your gear on, except perhaps your fins. Depending on the environment, you may put them on first, or put them on in water waist to chest deep. As a general rule, use your regulator until you're floating in deeper water, so if you stumble, you can breathe even with your face under. In deeper water, fill your BCD and switch to snorkel to save air. If you're walking with fins on, walk backward or sideways and shuffle your feet. This helps avoid holes and obstructions and scares off animals that could sting if you step on them. As soon as the water's deep enough, swim out on the surface. Swimming's usually easier than wading. Surf entries and exits require special training, but it's possible you'll enter and exit through mild surf during your open water dives. Your instructor will cover surf entries and exits specific to your dive site. You'll find open water surface swimming a bit different from your confined water dives because you'll cover longer distances and may have currents and waves. Fill your BCD no more than about halfway to minimize drag and pace yourself. Surface swimming's more tiring than underwater swimming. Use your snorkel and breathe cautiously so you don't choke on waves splashing into it. Remember to keep your feet underwater, and you might prefer swimming on your back. Check your location, direction, and buddy frequently. There are a few differences between open water descents and the ones you've practiced in confined water, but one is you're going down farther. If you're weighted properly, emptying your BCD and exhaling should start you down. Remember to equalize early, often, and without forcefulness before you feel discomfort. Keep your head above your feet so you stay oriented. Your descent rate speeds up as water pressure compresses your exposure suit, so put air in your BCD as you go to reach the bottom neutrally buoyant. You may use a line for the first couple of dives. If it's an anchor line, avoid getting jerked up and down by letting your arm swing up and down with the line as the boat rises and falls on the waves. Ready? You're ready to hit Confined Water Dive 3, and you'll be in open water real soon.